Hello and welcome to Euronews Tonight. Here are your top stories. More Russian missiles target Ukraine as the search for survivors continues after yesterday's deadly strike on a shopping mall. A NATO summit in Madrid. What next steps as war rages on its doorstep? In Texas, a cry for help leading to a shocking discovery. Dozens of migrants found dead in a truck.
And Lewis Hamilton calls for action after a video emerges of former F1 world champion Nelson Piquet using racist language.
Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Rescue teams in Ukraine are searching for victims in what remains of a shopping mall in the central city of Kremenchuk, bombed by Russian missiles yesterday afternoon. At least 18 people have been killed and scores more injured in what President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling one of the most daring terrorist attacks in European history. Authorities are sifting through the smoldering rubble where some 40 people are believed to be still missing. The local government has declared a day of mourning for the victims. And joining me now in the studio is correspondent Sasha Vakulina. Sasha, the search is ongoing. What more can you tell us about the Kremenchuk strike? Let's start with that.
Well, that number of 18 people dead, the number that is now confirmed, is indeed expected to rise now. The other thing that happened yesterday in Kremenchuk is, of course, that there were air raid sirens right before the attack, and therefore many people managed to go to a bomb shelter close by, and this is something that saved and helped so many of them.
Casualties could have been a lot worse then.
Absolutely. Now, of course, Zelensky condemned this attack, calling it one of the most defiant terrorist attacks in the European history. We've heard wide condemnation from the G7 countries, and there were two different messages coming from Russia, from Moscow. Now, in the immediate hours following the strike, Russian state media and some officials in Moscow said, quote, that this was a Bucha-styled planned Ukraine provocation staged to accuse Moscow of war crimes. And then only later on that Russia's defense ministry said that it hit a weapons depot that stored high-precision air-launched missiles in a strike aimed at destroying US and European supplies for Ukraine's armed forces. It was not only Kremenchuk that was hit yesterday so badly, there was also Kharkiv.
Yeah, now, this is a part of a wider strategy, isn't it? What's behind this strategy?
Now, we've seen the civilians being hit in Kharkiv, we've seen civilians being hit in Lysychansk. There we saw civilians were collecting water from a water tank when at least 8 people died and 21 got wounded. Now, what's behind that? This is something that Kyiv authorities are calling a campaign of missile terror. And this happened again today, this afternoon. A big city of Dnipro in central Ukraine was shelled. Now, they struck a car repair shop. According to the local authorities, there were 6 missiles, out of them 3 got intercepted. Indeed, over the past couple of days, Russia stepped up the airstrikes on Ukraine, and this is something that could be somehow explained. This echoes the statement by some of the U.S. officials that said that Russian forces are increasingly relying on artillery and missile strikes to advance their operations in Ukraine. The Institute for the Study of War also points out that they continue to burn through their supply of high-precision weaponry. And the UK Defence Ministry intelligence report also says that Russia fielded the core elements of 6 different armies, yet achieved only tactical success at Severodonetsk. Therefore, this is why this is something that can explain this new strategy and what we've been seeing.
What about the potential response from the West? Beyond criticism, what could the West be doing at this point?
Well, based on the requests by Ukrainian officials and specifically by Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, what they can do, they can provide more heavy weapons and equipment, including some of the air defense equipment.
Yeah, there's still a lot of talk about air defenses there. Yeah, right. We'll have to see what happens with NATO, right? And thank you very much, Sasha. Thank you for joining us. And that segues over to the NATO leaders who have arrived in Madrid for a 3-day summit. The military alliance is expected to agree on a new strategy to expand its rapidly deployable forces rather than relying on deterrence alone. Moscow's aggression has led to Finland and Sweden applying to join NATO, and their bid will be high on this week's agenda. But Turkey is still blocking their accession. In his opening remarks this afternoon, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg outlined what he called a comprehensive assistance package to help Ukraine defend itself. Let's hear.
It is extremely important that we are ready to continue to provide support because Ukraine now faces a brutality which we haven't seen in Europe since the Second World War.
So let's cross live to Madrid and speak to our correspondent, Effie Kotsukosta. Effie, is there any headway on getting Turkey to finally allow Finland and Sweden to join NATO?
Hi, Chris. Yes, actually, this is what everybody here wants to hear in the end. But no white smoke yet. But now, what we know so far is that a meeting between the President Erdogan, the Turkish President, and the Swedish Prime Minister, Finnish President, and Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is still ongoing. They are trying to find ways to break the deadlock and finally at least have a political declaration during these days, during the NATO summit, before announcing the new strategic concept of NATO. What some diplomats were telling us from the Finnish part is that actually the differences that remain are between Turkey and Sweden, and about, the legislation for terrorism and other stuff related to that. But for other diplomats, what is key here is the meeting that Erdogan will have tomorrow with the American President Joe Biden. And why is key this meeting is because for many people, for many diplomats in NATO, the main concern of Erdogan is not only all these concerns about terrorism or lifting arms embargo from these two countries, but actually getting the F-16 fighter jets from the United States. This program, as we know, Turkey is already excluded from the F-35 program of the United States, and now what they want is to modernize their equipment with this F-16. So if he can get this, maybe we will see a green light for these two countries to join the alliance. And also there is another meeting with Emmanuel Macron tomorrow morning in the margins of the summit, where he also said that he will try to convince Erdogan to really give the green light to these two countries to have at least an announcement over the coming days.
So potential headway there. What about on Ukraine? As more rockets, Russian rockets, are falling on Ukrainian cities, what more could we see coming from NATO as far as that goes?
Of course, Ukraine will be at the heart of the discussions here at NATO summit between the leaders. And what Jens Stoltenberg announced is a comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine. What does this mean? Of course, more equipment, more financial also support, but also they will discuss the transition from the Soviet-era weapons to more modern weapons and how this transition will take place, who will give what. So this is also going to be discussed, agreed and announced at the end of this summit. And of course, we shouldn't forget that what it was already announced during the weekend from the G7 leaders, that the Western leaders will support Ukraine as long as it takes. This is also going to be reconfirmed here in Madrid, that everybody is ready to help Ukraine with military equipment, but also with money in order to really win this war without any deadline.
Okay, let's see what comes out of that at the end. Effie, thank you very much. Thank you. As the focus switches to the NATO meeting in Madrid, the G7 wrapped up its annual summit in Germany with a raft of new pledges. Leaders from the group of the 7 richest democracies reiterated their support for Ukraine and agreed to target Russia's finances and raise the costs of Moscow's war. With that conflict wreaking havoc on food and energy supplies, they pledged more than 4 billion euros toward food security and committed to measures aimed at reducing and stabilizing global energy prices. We'd like to go on to that summit, do a wrap-up on that summit with Shona Murray, our correspondent over there in Germany. Shona, the first meeting of the G7 leaders since this outbreak of the war, with lots of support for Ukraine on show. Are there hopes for more new measures proposed at this summit that will slow down Russia's war machine?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's sort of the point of the sanctions, particularly those announced today, because I don't think anyone feels that they're ever going to influence Putin to change direction of the war. We heard at the very start a few days ago that the US has decided to sanction Russian gold, the UK also, and the EU has agreed to do that. Obviously needs 27 member states to confirm that it'll do that. And then we had this announcement confirmed again today that the G7 will pursue a price cap for oil and possibly gas, which will help stabilise the price of oil for developing countries and countries that are accessing Russian oil after the EU and Western sanctions, but also will reduce the price so that you reduce Russia's revenue and therefore slow down its war chest. There's really a feeling in the G7 that although Russia has been able to sell and make a lot of money from energy, that in the medium term the sanctions definitely will work. For example, there's strong sanctions against technologies that help the Russian army modernise, not just the army, but also the economy modernise as well. So they are confident that the sanctions are working, but I think there's probably a little bit of disappointment that Russia is still getting so much revenue from energy.
Yes, well, we're seeing some evidence of financial pressures on Moscow. Regarding the pledges on food and energy that we mentioned a few moments ago, what concretely could that money go for?
Well, it was different strands, I suppose. I mean, they said there was about 29 billion euro in total pledged for Ukraine for financial humanitarian assistance, for also the reconstruction of Ukraine. That was very much on top of the agenda here, that there will be a future for Ukraine and it will require no less than essentially a Marshall-type fund. But aside from that, we have seen the exportation of a food crisis as a result of the Russian blockade of the Black Sea, where important crops, wheat and so on, can't leave Ukraine, and this is obviously affecting low-income countries, developing countries, so that's hugely problematic. There was 4.5 billion euro pledged to deal with food security, but NGOs here attending say that's not near enough. And I caught up with Stefan Exo-Kreischer from the One campaign. He says they're very, very disappointed with this amount.
Actually pretty disappointed. If you looked at, they only committed 4.5 billion US dollars in new money at this summit, and then calculated in total, also counting old money, they said they came up with 14 billion US dollars to tackle the hunger crisis, and that's far from enough. The World Food Programme alone needs more than 20 billion US dollars this year. So I would have liked to see much more ambition from the G7 leaders on tackling the immediate humanitarian crises, and I would have liked to see some more concrete proposals, or at least ideas, of how to unblock Ukrainian ports to ensure that the grain that is there and that's so desperately needed on the African continent, that it's actually getting there.
And that's Stefan Exo-Kreischer from the One campaign, echoing what I've heard from a lot of NGOs, that 4.5 billion euro won't go far enough to deal with the food insecurity and crisis that's emerging from the Ukraine war, but on top of that, because of climate change, because of famine and so on. So they're bitterly disappointed about what is being pledged here in Bavaria.
Shona, thank you very much. 50 people have been found dead in an abandoned truck container on the outskirts of the U.S. city of San Antonio, Texas. Authorities say that the cause of death was heat stroke as temperatures soared to almost 40 degrees with no water nor working air conditioning to be found at the scene. Survivors were described as hot to the touch and were taken to hospital in a weakened state. Speaking to reporters, the mayor of San Antonio called it a tragedy.
There are, that we know of, 46 individuals who are no longer with us, who had families, who were likely trying to find a better life. And we have 16 folks who are fighting for their lives in the hospital. Our focus right now is to try to bring aid to them as best we can, but this is nothing short of a horrific human tragedy.
The U.S. congressional panel investigating the storming of the Capitol Hill on January 6 last year will hear a top aide of former President Donald Trump. The committee announced the surprise hearing with only 24 hours' notice. Cassidy Hutchinson will be a vital witness in the investigation. The 25-year-old was a special assistant and aide to Trump's chief of staff and has already sat for multiple interviews behind closed doors. Disgraced British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell is awaiting sentencing today for her sex trafficking conviction connected to her role facilitating Jeffrey Epstein's sexual abuse of underage girls. Maxwell was found guilty in December last year by a federal jury on 5 charges, including sex trafficking, between the years of 1994 and 2004. The 60-year-old faces up to 55 years in prison and has always maintained her innocence. We can now go to New York and speak to our reporter, Susan Tirani. Susan, the sentencing could be any minute now. What are you hearing from the victims that are awaiting this sentencing?
Well, Chris, the judge has received victim impact statements from a number of Ghislaine Maxwell's alleged victims: Annie Farmer, Maria Farmer, the witness known as Kate, Sarah Ransom, and Elizabeth Stein, a number of which are here in New York in the courtroom. The 2 latter have been given permission to read their deeply emotional testimony. And we have some of that emotional testimony of Stein, which reads, "I was assaulted, raped, and trafficked countless times in New York and Florida during a 3-year period." She also talks about how she became pregnant and had to abort a baby. And she writes that she still cannot provide the vocabulary to describe what happened to her in the hands of Jeffrey Epstein because of Ghislaine Maxwell. And also, despite not being part of the indictment, there is a victim impact statement by Virginia Joffrey. She says, quote unquote, "Maxwell opened the doors to hell so she could be abused by Jeffrey Epstein."
Wow. Now, we will hear this sentencing, but the story probably won't be over, right? We can probably expect an appeal from Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyers, couldn't we? And how soon would that come, do you think?
Right. So we have to first wait and see whether or not the judge will even let Ghislaine Maxwell really grant that appeal to Ghislaine Maxwell and her lawyers. But what will happen then is, it will basically rule out the fact that she would have any remorse because of that appeal on the one hand. And the other hand, it would really restrict what she would or would not say even today during today's hearing. I mean, we still don't know whether or not she will talk. So far, she has not taken the stand to talk. And ultimately, that lack of remorse, even after the appeal, could even provide her with a heftier sentence at the end of the day. So the appeal may not be to her benefit.
Right. So stay tuned. Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has proposed holding a second referendum next year on independence from the UK. Sturgeon stressed the importance of both the UK and Scottish governments agreeing to a legal path for the proposed vote. But the British government says it won't agree, insisting the matter was decided in 2014 when Scotland opted to stay within the UK in a countrywide referendum. Speaking today in the Scottish Parliament, Sturgeon made her case for the poll and for independence.
Presiding officer, now is the time, at this critical moment in history, to debate and decide the future of our country. Now is the time to get Scotland on the right path, the path chosen by those who live here. Now is the time for independence.
So Lewis Hamilton has spoken out after former Formula One world champion Nelson Piquet used racist language when referring to the British driver. Piquet's comments had also been condemned by motorsport authorities. Let's find out a little bit more about that from Matthew in the Cube. Matthew, please.
Well, Chris, Lewis Hamilton, the 7-time Formula One world champion, says that now is the time for action after a video emerged of the former Brazilian driver Nelson Piquet using racist language when referring to him. Piquet, who himself has won 3 world titles in F1, was speaking on a podcast last year in which he was discussing an accident involving Hamilton and Max Verstappen, the Red Bull F1 driver who is incidentally dating Piquet's daughter. Now, Piquet said that Hamilton was playing dirty, and he also accused the British driver of being a joke, saying that it was lucky that only Verstappen had crashed on this incident in the first lap of the British Grand Prix, and he used a derogatory term when referring to Hamilton. His comments have been widely condemned, Hamilton himself writing on Twitter in both English and Portuguese, saying that it's more than language. These archaic mindsets need to change and have no place in our sport. I've been surrounded by these attitudes, he says, and targeted my whole life. There has been plenty of time to learn. Formula One, which has a clear programme against racism, also condemned Piquet's comments, as did the international body for motorsport, the FIA. They said that they express solidarity with Hamilton and fully support his commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion. The British driver is well known for his support for human rights causes, as well as his condemnation of racial injustice. Incidentally, it's not the first time that Piquet has been accused of derogatory comments. But now, Hamilton, one of the most successful drivers in Formula One, says, Chris, that now is the time for action, not just solidarity.
Matthew, thank you so much. The tragedy in Texas regarding migrants. Well, consider this. Recent UN figures suggest that last year around 90 million people were forced to flee conflict, persecution, and human rights abuses. Now, a former refugee camp in Denmark has been transformed into an extraordinary museum that aims to tell the stories of people behind the numbers. Louise Miner reports.
In a quiet and peaceful wooded area in western Denmark, a refugee camp that housed up to 100,000 people from Germany after World War II has been turned into a unique museum. There are stories of those who fled their homelands from Iran, Lebanon, Hungary and Vietnam to provide a better understanding, particularly during a time when people continue to flee.
Do not dare taking up difficult issues and themes that are relevant for the day being. The museums are not relevant. I hope the visitors will get a broader understanding of why people flee, how they flee, and how it affects people to have been refugees.
Official statistics show that more than 2,500 people have sought asylum in Denmark this year. 5 years ago, 19-year-old Rahima Abdullah sought safety after fleeing Syria.
Today, refugees are being reduced to numbers. One forgets that behind the concept of refugees, there are people who have their own stories to tell. Quite ordinary people who have become refugees because of something they have not chosen themselves.
The museum tries to put visitors in the shoes of a refugee by recording testimonies, making the visit historic, political, personal and humanitarian. According to the UNHCR, nearly 90 million people are currently forced to move around the world. Louise Miner, Euronews.
Being in the shoes of a refugee. Thanks so much for joining us on Euronews Tonight.